is Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So there's a really good series on the web, on YouTube. This guy's a history professor, well, history, culture, etc. I've been loving his videos. So he did this one on Hegel, and he's given this this dynamic between idealism and realism, essentially these aspects of how philosophers see the world to some degree. I'm going to let him explain it, but I want to talk about it after he explains it, because I think this is fascinating. And I find myself hitting these questions myself. So this one in particular.
One person who is a proponent of relativism, the other an ardent foe of relativism. These are two of the most important thinkers of the latter part of the 19th century. They in some ways set up the problematic of the 20th century. Their ideas have a huge impact on thinkers throughout the 20th century. And so looking at the contrast between them, I think can help us to understand the kinds of issues that people are wrestling with as the 20th century dawns. Before we get to those thinkers themselves, let's think about relativism all by itself. I've been talking about these two-level theories, where there's a manifest image of the world more or less as we find it, and of ourselves as we find ourselves. It's one that's characterized by a conception of ourselves as rational beings, governed by some kind of moral law, taking responsibility for actions because we see ourselves as causally responsible for those actions. We see ourselves as doing things. We see ourselves as acting freely. We think of ourselves as using practical reason, figuring out what means to take in order to attain our goals. However, according to the scientific image, we're really just beings governed by causal laws. That seems to be a completely value-free image. It doesn't make any sense to ask whether its basic laws or conditions are right or wrong. And it looks as if things are either purely determined or, at best, determined to some degree and then affected with some degree of randomness. Well, it's easy for theories like that to lead to relativism, where one looks at the manifest image, the values that are expressed there, the conceptions of rationality, and you say, look, really that might be right, only given a certain way in which things are working at the base level. And so it can tempt one to think that truth itself is relative to something or other. Now, there are a lot of different forms of relativism. You might think that what is true is relative to an individual person, that certain things could be true for you, but not true for me. You might think things are relative to a society. So what is true depends on a certain particular society and its concepts. You might think it's dependent on a culture, or what some authors have referred to as an interpretive community. A community may be much smaller than a given society, may be much larger than it, that adopts a certain conceptual framework. And so you could think of things as relative to a set of concepts that we use for understanding the world. Finally, you might think of things as relative to a certain historical period, a certain historical epoch or era. And that particular version, as we'll see, is called historicism. But in any case, the idea here is that things aren't really universally and absolutely true. They're only true relative to something or other. Now, certain things people often think are relative to individual people, and it's relatively uncontroversial that they are. For example, if I say mushrooms are yummy, I think that's true, but you might disagree, right? You might hate mushrooms. And so, in fact, when I was in elementary school, I used to trade kids for mushrooms and for peas. They would often serve peas, and it was like, I love peas. Peas are awesome. And so I would trade people desserts and rolls and other things like that to get peas. So I had these. And then people would say, well, I don't want to eat these peas, so I'll just get lots of free peas. So I just have a big mound of peas. And I thought that was fantastic. Okay, now, I still think that's fantastic. I love peas. But in any event, so peas are yummy, mushrooms are yummy. Those things are true for me. On the other end, they might not be true for you. Or it might be that you love other kinds of things that I despise, like what? Those rubbery, horrible things. Calamari. Okay. What? Yeah, I know. See, a lot of people like calamari. To me, calamari are disgusting. You might as well just eat rubber bands. And so, in any event, things like that, we sort of think, yeah, all right, this is yummy, that's not yummy. That's relative to an individual person, we ordinarily think. But there are lots of things we don't think are relative to a given person or to a given society. What are some things that are candidates for real absolute truth? Not dependent on you or me, not dependent on a historical era, not dependent on a particular set of concepts or a certain culture or its framework. What are things that might be absolute truths? Yeah?
Gravity.
Good, the law of gravitation. You might think that's something that's really true at all times and all places. It's not like, well, gravity is true for you, but it's not true for me. I just find myself rising into the air. I put glue on my shoes. Right? It's not like that. No, it applies across the board, or at least we ordinarily think so. Yeah? Mathematics, good. 2 plus 2 is 4. That's something that seems to be true no matter who you are. It's not like, well, 2 plus 2 is 4 in Austin. But the closer you get to Waco, the more it starts shading off. No, it's not like that, right? It's true all over the place. Other candidates, yeah. Good, the laws of physics in general. It's not just gravitation. Force is mass times acceleration, for example. That seems to be true across the board, right? We don't say, well, you know, force is now mass times acceleration, but if you go back to the 19th century, it was something else. No, we tend to think that's something that applies at all times and places, in all cultures, in all historical epochs. Are there other things? Yeah?
OU sucks.
OU sucks. We've talked about that one. That might be, although...
No, it is. No, it is.
Yeah, sorry, I can't think of a counterexample. Yeah. Okay, I think therefore I am. That's one we talked about earlier too, and that's something you might take to be universal. As we mentioned, it's really not necessarily true at all times and all places, but every time I can say it, right? Every time it's thought or uttered, it's true. So the relativist has a tough row to hoe. The relativist has to say, look, I'm not just talking about things like peas or yummy, I'm talking about all of that. Everything, truth itself is relative. And that's something that at least doesn't seem to be true in our common sense appreciation of the world. So what kinds of arguments do relativists give? What can they say? Ultimately, this position goes back to the thought of Georg Hegel, who wrote at the beginning of the 19th century. He's very influential, and we would read him if his writing was intelligible, but it's very, very difficult. In any case, he lays out a series of arguments that increasingly tempt people toward relativism throughout the later part of the 19th century and then the 20th century. Now, what are some of these arguments? The first is that he rejects what he refers to, and later authors like Sellers refer to, as the myth of the given. He calls it immediacy. He says there is no such thing as immediacy. There is no such thing that is simply given to us in experience. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, Kant earlier had drawn a sharp line between sensibility and understanding, between what we perceive and then the concepts we use to analyze what we perceive. You might say, what am I perceiving right now? Well, a classroom full of people. And so you could characterize that maybe in terms of things that have concepts in them, like a classroom full of people, right? I'm using the concepts, classroom, people. But I might think, look, I could characterize this in a way that has nothing to do with that. I might just, for example, take a photograph. And then I could say, here's what I'm looking at, here's what I'm perceiving, and that would be something that seems to be free of concepts. However, Hegel says, there isn't such a sharp line to be drawn. When I perceive all of you, I don't just see this swirling mass, I don't just see a bunch of pixels or something like that, it's not just a bunch of rods and cones on the retina being activated. My mind immediately sorts things into objects. I see people, I see desks and tables, I see a camera, I see a variety of things in front of me, and I immediately categorize those in terms of concepts I have. So his claim is, there really isn't a sharp line between sensation and cognition. In sensing the world, in perceiving the world, I am already categorizing it, he says. I'm already classifying things using concepts. So there's a sense in which people who have totally different sets of concepts actually perceive things differently. They see things differently because one is seeing, let's say, just shapes. Another is seeing people. And that's a fundamental difference. So he argues that our perception of the world is concept-laden, even at the most basic levels. There is no level, he thinks, where we're just perceiving things before we get to conceptually analyzing it, before we think, wait, what am I seeing? Now, there's an obvious argument on the other side. Wait, sometimes I do, right? Sometimes I perceive something and I don't know what to think about it. So I look at a scene and I say, what is that? Or I look at a Jackson Pollock painting and I say, what is that? My father, for years, had what a lot of people thought was a print of a Jackson Pollock painting behind his desk in his office at work. In fact, the painter in the building had just had this table, and he had spilled paint on it over the years, and finally decided to get a new table. My father said, can I have that tabletop? And he hung it on the wall. People thought it was a Jackson Pollock. And so you might say, yeah, what is that? Well, it might just be drips of paint. Maybe it's something else. In any case, you might think, I can look at it and analyze it in terms of, well, yeah, I don't want to analyze it even. I can just tell you what it is I'm seeing before I have any idea of how to categorize what I'm seeing. But Hegel says, no, even at the most basic levels, my concepts are already involved. So he says the concepts we have shape the way we perceive the world. But of course what we perceive is the world, so it follows that our concepts shape what the world is. There is no way to really separate the world as it is from the world as it seems to us. There's no sharp separation between two terms that Kant used, appearances and things in themselves. Yeah?
It seems like a logical jump to go from the way we perceive the world, determines what we think it is, to that is the way the world is. Because he may not perceive there as being any gravity, but there still is gravity. I feel that he makes a couple jumps there that don't have any sort of logic to them. Yeah, just what he wants them to be.
Okay, good, yes. How good is this as an argument, actually? Hegel is advancing it kind of as an argument. I say kind of as an argument because sometimes I think he's giving you arguments. Sometimes I think he's really trying to get you to undergo a gestalt shift. He's trying to say, you've been seeing the world this way, I want you to see it this way, think about it this way instead, and the arguments don't actually lead much of anywhere. If we go carefully here, we can say, well, all right, there's the first sort of argument that really we can't perceive things independently of concepts, that concepts do shape what we perceive. And we can ask whether that's true or false. Right? Is that true or is it false? That's a complicated sort of question. You might think it's sort of obviously false because we can, after all, take photographs and say, there, that's what I'm seeing. On the other hand, you might think, well, if you analyze what the brain is doing, maybe there really isn't a very sharp division. Maybe the moment information is transferred from the retina, for example, my conceptual apparatus and parts of the brain that involve that are already operating on it. And so, from that point of view, it seems like a complicated neurophysiological problem, whether these are different components in the brain or whether they get all mixed up. And it's not obvious which way it goes. One would really have to know a lot about the brain and how it works to be able to tell that. There is some evidence that actually these things are at certain levels intertwined. A good example is a kind of case where people show words that denote colors, like the word orange, but it's in blue. And they ask you to read it aloud. Okay? And they keep doing this. There's the word red, R-E-D, but it's in green, and so on. And it freaks people out. They find it hard to do. That's some evidence that perception and cognition are kind of mixed up together at some level. But in the end, you're right. As an argument, that's not much of an argument. We'd really have to get into the neurophysiology and understand how all this works.
All right, so that question of, well, wait a minute, what is real versus what do I think is real? Now here's the first thing. If you're watching a race and they fired a gun, now let's say instead of firing a gun, they flashed a light. Firing the gun, those people start off faster. Now the reason they start off faster, even though light is faster than everything else, is because the visual apparatus takes processing into account. I mean, before that information hits your brain, for the most part, that information has been affected by cognitive processes. It's shaping the way you see the world. There's certain things that for the most part you may not perceive at all. You're looking at a particular paper, you're reading it, your brain is adding information to it, but you're skipping words because your brain for the most part knows what's supposed to be there. The reason why you don't see that you put two its in that situation is because your brain has already said, well, that's just supposed to be it. It skips the process. Your brain is adding stuff to the world that you're looking at. In fact, your reality for the most part is shaped by what's going on in your skull. All of it. There's no light inside your head unless you're seeing light. You're getting a visual image, there's an electrical impulse. You have light, you have sound. All these things are just electrical impulses. We have no idea what this is. We have no idea what the real world is like because ultimately our perspective of the real world is changed by our own cognitive stuff. There is no objective perspective of the world. That's what I'm getting at. Like, I love this particular argument, this thing of realism versus idealism. And I think the argument is somewhat false and unnecessary. Both of those things are true. So, is there a real world out there? So, yes, there are going to be things. If I dig a shovel and I put a bunch of sand, let's say I dig a grave. I did dig that grave. That is a real thing that took place. That is physical to the degree that it's physical. It's something that took place in the world. Yes, I had X number of buckets in doing that particular process. Yes, that's fine. But you're also going to have some things of people perceiving things in a subjective way. Meaning, yes, I did that. There is a reality there associated with it. There are people who perceive something a particular way, and for them, that particular reality is that particular reality. Like, I understand this thing that there are subordinate realities, meaning there are realities that have to be taken into account, meaning social needs. But at the same token, how people see the world in this way is often colored by their own processes. None of them see the world as the world is. So even there may be an actual world there, they don't necessarily ever touch that actual world. Like you get a poll and you say, okay, X number of people in the country believes X, Y, Z. How do you know? How do you know? You're focusing on the poll and you're taking that information as just information. But how do you actually know? That poll may be accurate to some level of degrees, but what is that actually telling you? It's telling you that yes, these people are out there, but that doesn't really give you that much information. You have no idea why those people vote that way. You don't even know if the accuracy of that particular poll is getting what those people are actually saying, because they've had to skew the poll themselves, meaning cognitive processes that went into actually writing a poll to some degree affects that particular poll. It does it, it's like you can't get away from it. In your world, your reality. You're creating that reality. You're creating it. You look at an object, you assign a particular value to an object. That's a chair, that's a sofa, that's a couch, that's a TV. Well, you have a cognitive thing in your head where you know what that thing is. It's almost like from a physical level, you've identified a particular object, and that object has presence in your mind. It's unacknowledged because it's done automatically, but you look at a particular thing, you have recognition of that thing, you know what it is. That's a cognitive thing. Your brain is not getting you to the point where you see a cup, you say, oh right, that's a cup. That information is already there. The process, that whatever did, put that there, that's presence at that point in your mind of what that object is. That presence, however, is different for each particular individual, because each individual is different in the way they were raised, in the way they behave, in their own cognitive processes. So yes, I recognize that as a cup, but what a cup to me is different than a cup to her. Is the reality of the fact that there's a cup there, does it matter? Yeah, there's a cup there per se. So yeah, the realism in that sense is there is reality underlying this thing. But there's also other realities associated with this thing, giving this thing a particular meaning. In and of itself, that cup doesn't exist. The perspective of the cup makes it a cup, if that makes sense. It's almost like the reality per se, there is realism in the sense that yes, real things happen. The catch is how those things are never perceived exactly as those things are. Those things are always going through a cognitive process that is going to change some of the information. Even when you're being objective, certainly there are always things you can't necessarily know, meaning there is always context that you're not going to have. It's always going to be a certain level of subjectiveness in whatever decision you make on that point. The realities that people are focusing in, when they're seeing objects and everything else, they have different cognitive processes that gives them those particular objects, and those things are weighed differently in their head. When I say a blue car, that blue car has a certain connotation to me. It may go back to my childhood. It may go back to something that I wanted. When I smell those cheese crackers for Christmas, yeah, that has a certain significance to me. It has a weight in my head. There's a cognitive weight associated with what that thing is and what the thing represents. That's purely subjective. That thing in and of itself is nothing. My identification with it gives it value. If that makes sense, I'm hoping I'm making sense on this point. It's your reality is for the most part subjective. Who the hell knows what the real world is actually like? We use our senses, this vehicle, in order to interact with the environment, but this vehicle doesn't pick up everything in the environment. So yes, this is our reality, this is our dimension. But there may be all sorts of stuff out there that our senses just can't pick up. If that makes sense. We have no idea what this is. And us interacting with it is always going to be a certain level of subjectivity in the way we're interacting with it. Because ultimately, you're always going to have information you don't know. And you're always going to have preconceived biases and ideas that push you to think of something in a particular way. The very act of just, I'm fascinated by this because it's presence of mind. It's, like, you think of a pink elephant. Alright, you have this idea of a pink elephant in your head. Think of a rocking chair. Maybe your grandmother said it. Well, to you, that has a certain level of weight and significance. It's not heavy, it's not anything, and yet there's presence and there's a reality of it. It's hard to explain that. It's hard to get that across. It's almost like if you had a matrix of sorts. And somebody says, okay, you have a particular object. One person looks at this particular object, and based on everything that took place in that person's past, everything that that person wants, everything that makes up that particular individual, that thing, that's just the thing, that has no name, no nothing associated with it, is the thing that's just sitting there. She makes it a chair. That chair has an identity. It has weight in her head. She knows what it is. She knows the connection for it. Take anything else. A car, a basketball, a tennis racket, whatever. Whatever those things are, ultimately, those things are looked at differently. Meaning, this ink pen is just a thing. My perspective of the ink pen itself, the way I identify it, makes that thing an ink pen. We've all agreed that that's an ink pen. But really, it's nothing. It's nothing at all. It's the perspective of it that gives it some kind of value and weight associated with it. Yes, there is a real physical thing there. That's kind of what I'm saying. This idea of realism and idealism, that it's somewhat of a false choice. It's not one or the other, it's both. Yes, there is something there. Clearly, there is something there where in physical matter reality, there is something there. The designation of it, it's our subjectivity. That's our idealism. That's us projecting something onto a particular thing. And after we project that thing, there's a weight in our head on it. I'm using the term weight only to get across this idea that there's a space that's designated, that is assigned a certain value to it. That value goes far beyond just labels that you would give it. It goes into even an emotional basis of what that thing might be. Think of something that you might have got from somebody who died. So it's somebody who passed. Maybe it's a watch. Maybe it's a belt. Maybe it's a pair of shoes. Whatever. How you feel about it? Because if you notice, your perspective of things, of those particular objects, those objects are just things. The moment that you attach something to it, all your memories, all your feelings, all those things are wrapped up as an information packet of sorts. It's a designation. That's why I keep saying it carries weight. It's not just, this is an ink pen. It's a bunch of other things that are attached to the fact that it's an ink pen. Some of those things I can't even dredge up because I don't necessarily understand. And yet, this thing has a certain place in my mind that has a designation that goes far beyond just writing device. It's like that with everything. Your cognitive apparatus pulls those things in. It may update the information for the most part, but it's not a situation where you look at the world and everything is new. You look at the world, those things just are. The concepts are things that you yourself are turning those things into. Without those concepts, those things don't exist. And when I'm saying don't exist, I just mean the conception of the thing doesn't exist. The object may be real, but the object is just an object. The designation of it is something that we ourselves assign to it. And look, the more interesting the object, the more stuff that we assign to it. It's pretty fascinating when you think about it. Like, think about something that you really, really like and you really, really prize. Something that's important to you. Maybe you did something. Maybe you won a championship. Whatever. That thing is just an object. It's just a trinket. It's something that you have sitting on your stand. But what are the things associated with it? It goes beyond just that's a trophy. It goes beyond a lot of attachments. It's almost like if you had a computer file and you put a bunch of stuff in that particular file associated with that particular thing. That's the weight that the thing makes up, and that's the designation. And that's designation. It doesn't exist without you to give it. I think that's what the point they're trying to make. I'm making this point that, yeah, the idealism is right. But yes, there is a physical reality to it. Both of those things are not in conflict with one another, even though it's put in a way that sounds like they're in conflict. They're not. They're just different ways of perceiving the world. That perception is not wrong. They're just different ways of perceiving the world. There are some ways that are better perceiving than others. And so all these things aren't necessarily equal. Because like I said, there is a reality to it. So yes, there's gravity. So I am not just going to fly. It doesn't give a shit about what I feel about it. Yes, these things are subordinate realities. Insofar as these subordinate realities don't clash with the larger reality of things like gravity, space, time, social influences. As long as those things are not in conflict, then you can persist in your illusions any way you want. And I'm not saying illusions is a bad way. I'm just saying the way you identify the world in your reality. I don't know what that is. I would imagine that reality has a signature. I can't even say if the reality that you're perceiving is perceived in the exact same way that I'm perceiving my particular reality. And yet, those things are for the most part equal. Now again, there are realities that are more subordinate than others. If we're having this conversation about something of Syrian strike, yeah, the Syrian strike took place. So yeah, there is a real physical event associated with it. If I then turn around and say, Bashar al-Assad did it, needs to be taken out. Well, that's a perspective that's wrong. There is a tangible reality to the thing that took place. I'm making this case that, yeah, their idealism works in a real world in a sense, just because it's functionally how we function in an everyday thing. But when you get into questions of things that actually did take place, then yes, there is a realistic reality to those things. These things are not in conflict. The only difference is they fail at different points. And so what I mean is, and if you're going with this idealism model, there is a reality to things. Now, you may not cast that, meaning how I perceive this event, how I perceive Trump taking those missiles and shooting Bashar al-Assad. I have a certain perception of it, based again on my own thing. So my perception of that particular event, again, colors my perception of what took place. But something did take place. Like, so I'm getting at, yeah, there is a reality to that particular situation. There is a perspective that's wrong on that situation when they say the person had the right to do it. That perspective is wrong if they said Bashar al-Assad had a right to do it, meaning those are lesser perspectives. The better perspectives that are untainted by somebody wanting something, yeah, you are back into a certain amount of idealism of, if you're being earnest, this is a designation I give to this particular world. I don't think that's bad. I don't think those things are in conflict. I think those things fail at different points. Like the realism thing. Yeah, you may have something that's an object. You may have something that's taking place in the real world. But your perception will never give you the honest and accurate, pure representation of what took place. That's what I'm getting at. And that's what I'm saying, the fail point of realism. It's almost like it's this thing that you can never acquire, even though you know that thing probably exists. Yes, something took place. That thing took place in real physical time, and you could see it. There were multiple points of views and rods to doing it. So yeah, it's real. It's perfectly real. But then you get to the point of saying, okay, what took place? And the moment you get what took place, you've designated something. That's you, your mind, putting a designation on something and giving it a value and giving it a perspective. So yes, there's something real, but no, you can never actually touch that real thing. You can only have an ideal of the thing because your cognitive processes are always going to be in play. You're constrained by the places you've been, the things you know, and the things that you believe. So yes, your ideas are going to make up what takes place. So it's almost like, and this is kind of why I say they're not in conflict, because you would never be able to reach the actual reality of things. You can't perceive it. You don't have the information. You may not even be able to perceive other things that are around you all the time. But in this particular case, we're talking about physical matter reality. Something took place. So yes, realism is right. The problem with realism is you can never actually get to the thing that actually took place. You're always stuck with idealism. That's what I'm getting at. Your reality is constructed based upon the concepts that you have, your ideas of things. There's no way to touch the reality of it. There is no objective perspective that is the correct perspective. Like there is no root where somebody put their stake in the ground and say, God damn it, this is the perspective. Those things are relative to one another. Meaning everybody has a certain perception of the world. Some perceptions are more right than so others. But each one is living in their own specific perception. Each one identifies things in their own particular way. What I think of a pen, what I think of a blanket is different than what you think of a pen and what you think of a blanket. We just understand that this ability to write. But yes, how this weighs in your mind, it is different than how it weighs in mine and somebody else's and somebody else's. The world that you look at is purely idealism. But yes, there is a real thing that's taking place in that particular environment. Problem is you can just never touch it. You never touch it. It's almost like this hypothetical thing that took place. The fact that it happened has no meaning at all. It's just something that happened. The moment that you look at it and you bear upon it and you put your conception on it, you've just given it meaning. You've just given it substance. And you've just given it context. Beforehand, it didn't exist. It didn't exist. The very act of looking at it and very act of assigning it something, or weighing it up, giving it weight. And this is not something you necessarily do consciously. You don't say, okay, this is this size and this looks this. That's not what you're doing. Your brain is taking in new information. Once it takes in that new information, it makes an appraisal of that information. That appraisal is held in your consciousness to a degree, and it carries a particular weight. What you think of that particular event now, it's colored by the cognitive processes that took over. You can be perfectly objective and honest in your appraisal of it, but you're still never going to get to the complete truth of what that thing is. You can never know what that thing is in truth. I can never know what you are. You can never know what somebody else is. You can't get to those places. Yes, there's a real person there, but the person that you're looking at is purely your conception of that person. That person is something else. And yet, you have your idea of what that person is. You've defined them in your head. You even get mad at them when they don't follow your model. But ultimately, you can never touch who that person is. In the same way, you can never really touch what these objects are. You're always left with an idea of those things, not necessarily the reality of what those things are. I love this conversation that he had. So, alright guys, if you enjoyed the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe. You know, it's funny. This should have been a 420 one. It's like, blaze one if you got one. Let's talk about philosophy. But, yeah. This could be a 420. This could be a 420. I'll do a different opening. Yeah, if you like the content, feel free to subscribe, share, like, and you can always support the work through Patreon. Or even PayPal at this point. So, thanks guys. Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So let's talk about Hegel. There's a new professor who's been giving these history lessons of sorts. And it's on all sorts of topics, but the man is absolutely awesome. He's having this conversation about realism versus idealism. He's on the topic of Hegel. Now, the conversation comes up with regards to their philosophical basis of Hegel on this and the argument against. Let's play it first, and we can have a talk about it. I want to make this a 421, so blaze one if you got one, and let's take a look. This is actually really, really good. I'm hoping this goes okay, because I may want to do a few more of these. I also want to do some with Baldwin. It's a fascinating conversation. So I hope people like it. Let me know if it's too deep or too intellectual, but let's take a look.
Right, we'll talk about this much more next week.